one can only imagine what Sojourner Truth, an outspoken, tell it like it is kind of woman. And we all know a little something about that, right? Just to imagine what she would have to say about this incredible gathering. We are all here because, as my husband says time and time again, we stand on the shoulders of giants like Sojourner Truth. I hope that Sojourner Truth will be proud to see me, a descendant of slaves, serving as the First Lady of the United States of America. Now, many young boys and girls like my own daughters will come to Emancipation Hall and see the face of a woman who looks like them. And all the visitors in the U.S. Capitol will hear the story of brave women who endured the greatest of humanity's indignities. They'll hear the story of Sojourner Truth, who didn't allow those indignities to destroy her spirit, who fought for her own freedom and then used her powers, young people. Then she used her powers to help others. The power of this bust will not just be in the medal that delineates Sojourner Truth's face, it will also be in the message that defines her legacy. Forevermore, in the halls of one of our country's greatest monuments of liberty and equality, justice and freedom, Sojourner's Truth story will be told again and again and again and again.
Upon the hated auction block and see the children there. She pleads with you to sympathize with sighs and groans and scars, and note how base the tyranny beneath the stripes and stars. She is pleading for her people, a poor downtrodden race, who dwell in freedom's boasted land with no abiding place. When we look back in history, it seems so distant, like it's just so far away. But just a little while ago, Sojourner Truth walked here. She stood here where we live in this community. Against all odds, as a freed slave, Sojourner Truth met with Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States. She gives me a sense of pride about who I am and where I come from. Her life shows me that I can overcome any obstacle that stands in my way. As you watch Sojourner's story today, and you see all that she stood for, Think about yourself. What do you stand for?
The narrative of Sojourner Truth, a northern slave emancipated from bodily servitude by the state of New York in 1828, was first published in 1850. Since Sojourner Truth could not read or write, she depended upon others to record her memoirs. Sojourner told her story to Olive Gilbert, a fellow abolitionist who became her scribe and editor. I listened with amazement as her life unfolded before me, and I recorded as best I could her life story. In 1797, Sojourner Truth was born into slavery as Isabella Baumfree on the Hardenberg estate in Ulster County, New York, a Dutch enclave. She grew up speaking only Dutch.
I was one of 12 children of James and Elizabeth Baumfree.
Before she was half grown, Isabella had lost both parents and some 10 siblings. When Isabella was near 9 years old, according to her recollection, her slave master, Charles Hardenberg, died. The remaining Hardenbergs decided to free her father, James, as he was too old to work anymore.
They also decided to free my mother, Betsy, even though she was younger, to allow them both to continue living in the dark cellar.
But they decided to auction off Isabella and her younger brother, along with Charles Hardenberg's farm animals. Isabella was sold with a flock of sheep for the price of $100. The year was 1806. At age 11, Isabella was sold again, this time to Martinus Schreiber for $105.
I seldom saw my parents after that. I had heard that my mother died. My father, blind and unable to care for himself, had been abandoned by the Hardenbergs and everyone else to live alone in the shanty in the woods.
Finally, one winter, according to a haunting story Isabella told, he died, too feeble to keep a fire going, frozen by the cold.
Every night when the sun goes in, every night when the sun goes in, every night when the sun goes in, I lay down my head and mournful cry.
At the age of 13, Isabella was sold to John Dumont of New Paltz, New York for $175.
I would live with the Dumont family for some 16 years.
During which she passed through puberty, was married, and had 5 children, Diana, Peter, Elizabeth, and Sophia.
The 5th child died in infancy.
Every night when the sun goes in, every night when the sun goes in, every night when the sun goes in, I lay down my head and mournful cry. In 1817, New York State passed a law declaring that all slaves born prior to 1799 would be freed in 1827. Now, this included Isabella, who was born in 1797, but not her children.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go.
Doing farm labor for John Dumont and household labor for his wife Sally, Isabella worked long and hard. When she went into the field to work, she sometimes took some of her children with her. She put the infants in a basket, tied the basket by a rope to the branch of a tree, and set an older child to swinging it. Isabella would sometimes stay up all night, afraid to sleep, trying to do her work well enough to gain approval.
I spoke Dutch, and they spoke English.
And this was a formidable obstacle in the way of a good understanding between them.
A fruitful source of dissatisfaction for the mistress.
Rondemont would often beat Isabella.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh.
This was not so far from ordinary.
My mother said, when we were sold, we must ask God to make our masters good. And I asked who he was. She told me he sit up in the sky. When I was sold, I had a severe, hard master. And I was tied up in the barn and whipped, till the blood run down to the floor. And I asked God, why don't you come and relieve me? If I was you and you was tied up so, I would do it for you.
Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go.
After emancipation had been decreed by the state, Isabella's master told her if she would do well and be faithful, he would give her free papers 1 year before she was legally free by statute. On the arrival of July 4th, 1826,
the time he specified for receiving my free papers,
she claimed the fulfillment of her master's promise, but he refused on account, as he alleged, of the loss he had sustained by her having injured her hand. She pled that she had
worked all the time and done many things I was not wholly able to do.
But her master remained inflexible.
Ha!
She said with emphasis that cannot be written.
The slaveholders are terrible for promising to give you this or that or such a promise if you will do thus and so. And when the time of fulfillment comes and one claims the promise, they recollect nothing of the kind. And you are like as not taunted with being a liar.
But Isabella inwardly determined that she would remain with him only until she had spun his wool, and then she would leave him, taking the rest of the time to herself. One fine morning, a little before daybreak, she might have been seen stepping stealthily away from the rear of Master de Mont's house, her infant on one arm, her wardrobe on the other. As she gained the summit of a high hill a considerable distance from her master's, the sun offended her by coming forth in all his pristine splendor. She thought it never was so light before. Indeed, she thought it much too light. She stopped to look about her and ascertain if her pursuers were yet in sight. No one appeared, and for the first time the question came up for settlement.
Where and to whom shall I go?
In all her thoughts of getting away, she had not once asked herself whither she should direct her steps. She sat down, fed her infant, and again, turning her thoughts to God, her only help, she prayed him to direct her to some safe asylum.
Imagine having to choose between your children and your freedom. When Sojourner Truth walked out that morning, she left 3 of her children behind. I just keep thinking about all that she sacrificed and the impossible choices that she had to make.
Isabella found freedom for herself and her daughter Sophia at the home of Isaac and Marie Van Wagenen, a Quaker family.
Dumont tracked her down at the Van Wagenen's house and demanded her return.
Though morally opposed to slavery, the Van Wagenens agreed to pay John Dumont $20 for Isabella's release and $5 for the baby Sophia's freedom.
On July 4th, 1827, slavery was abolished in New York State. Some 10,000 African Americans were free. All night, all day, angels watching over me.
It was during the time with the Van Wagenens that I learned that my other son, Peter,
A child about 5 years old,
has been sold illegally out of New York State into the deep South.
the law expressly prohibited the sale of any slave out of the state.
When I heard that my son Peter had been sold south,
She immediately started on foot and alone to find the man who had thus dared, in the face of all law, to sell
my child out of the state.
With the financial help of Quakers in the area, Isabella fought in a Kingston court for the return of her son, managing to convince white lawyers to undertake the case.
Oh my God. I know that I'd have him again. Why, I was sure God would help me to get him. Why, I felt so tall with him. I felt as if the power of a nation was with me.
She won the case. Isabella was one of the first African American women in U.S. history to win a court case. She was fighting for the rights of her child, and she let nothing stand in her way.
Later that year, Isabella moved to New York City with her son, Peter. She joined the Matthias community, the religious communal colony. She attended church regularly. She and Peter stayed with them. In exchange for room and board, she did the cooking and cleaning and laundry for the community. The Matthias kingdom disbanded in 1834 amidst reports of murder, abuse, and scandal. She stayed in New York City for 8 years, supporting her son Peter and trying to keep him out of trouble. In 1839, Peter signed on as a crew member aboard the Zone of Nantucket. He died at sea, and Isabella would never see him again. In 1843, she left New York in search of a new community she could believe in.
Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
My name is Isabella. But when I left the house of bondage, I left everything behind. And so, I went to the Lord and asked him to give me a new name.
I walk and talk with my mind, stayed on freedom. I walk and talk with my mind, stayed on freedom. I walk and talk with my mind, stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. even walk from Springfield to Holyoke, let alone New York to Massachusetts. That took some serious determination.
The community held two main goals: to create an open-minded, stimulating place in which to live and work, and to realize a profit from the manufacturing of silk. Sojourner did not fall in love at first sight with the Northampton Association, but she thought she would make the effort to tarry with them one night. But as soon as she saw that accomplished, literary, and refined persons were living in that plain and simple manner, she said,
Well, if these people can live here, I can. I was moved to live in a community composed of some of the choicest spirits of the age, where all was characterized by an equality of feeling, a liberty of thought and speech, and largeness of soul, which I could not have before met with to the same extent in any of my wanderings.
Florence became a center of anti-slavery warfare. The workers in the cause were practically the whole village. Frequent anti-slavery meetings were held on Sundays by the great anti-slavery apostles: William Lloyd Garrison, David Ruggles, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass. Many conventions were held under the mammoth pine trees, which towered 150 feet in the air. A circular amphitheater of trees formed an ideal place for such a gathering. When Sojourner had been at the Northampton Association for a few months, she attended a nearby camp meeting held in open fields. During the course of the meeting, as another preacher was speaking, a mob of rowdy young men burst into the services, terrifying the worshippers and threatening to burn down the tents. Truth's first impulse was to hide behind a trunk, thinking,
I am the only colored person here, and only probably their wicked mischief will fall first, and perhaps fatally.
As the white woman preacher stood trembling on the preacher stand, Truth took the knight in hand. She left the tent, alone and unaided, and walking some 30 rods to the top of a small rise of ground, commenced to sing in her most fervent manner.
It was early in the morning! It was early in the morning, just at the break of day, when he rose, when he rose, when he rose and went to heaven on a cloud.
As she commenced to sing, the young men made a rush toward her, and she was immediately encircled by a dense body of the rioters, many of them armed with sticks or clubs. As the circle narrowed around her, she ceased singing, and after a short pause inquired in a gentle but firm tone,
Why do you come at me with clubs and sticks? I am not doing harm to anyone.
The mob responded with, We aren't going to hurt you, old woman. We came to hear you sing. She would sing one more song if they would leave in peace afterwards. Truth had assuaged their angry spirits and saved the meeting.
Just at the break of day, when he rose, when he rose, when he rose and went to heaven on a cloud.
In 1846, the Northampton Association disbanded as a result of insurmountable debt. Sojourner stayed in Northampton for another 13 years, worked as a housekeeper, and continued to speak and travel. As she recalled her time at the association,
I was with them heart and soul for anything concerning human rights. What good times we had.
in 1850, Sojourner Truth published the narrative of Sojourner Truth.
With Olive Gilbert as my scribe.
With the proceeds from the narrative, Sojourner took out a mortgage and finally purchased her own home for $300.
That same year, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, declaring that all runaway slaves must be brought back to their masters. People were even paid a reward for returning slaves. But at that same time in history, Sojourner Truth was buying her first home. I just love that.
In 1851, Sojourner left Northampton on one of her many speaking trips. She delivered what was to become her signature speech in Akron, Ohio at the Woman's Rights Convention, as reported by Marius Robinson, recording secretary of the convention and friend of Sojourner Truth.
I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's right. I have as much muscle as any man and can work as much as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I can carry as much as any man and eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have a little pint full? Oh, you needn't be afraid of woman's rights, for fear we will take too much, for we can take more than our pint will hold. All the men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Well, children, if you have women's rights, then give it to her. You will have your own rights, and there won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible and learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if woman upset the world, do give her a chance to turn it right side up again.
Sojourner Truth began touring the country, speaking at large and small gatherings.
Sojourner helped to fuel the movement for women's rights by speaking out every chance she had in the fight for equality. Sojourner spoke in New York City at the Broadway Tabernacle. If I could, I surely would. And on my way, Moses, Pharaoh finally got drowned. Oh, Mary,
Is it not good for me to come and draw forth a spirit, to see what kind of spirit people are of? I see that some of you have got the spirit of a goose, and some a snake. I feel at home here. I am a citizen of the state of New York. I was born in it, and I was a slave in the state of New York. And now I am a good citizen of this state.
oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep.
I was looking around and watching things, and I know a little mite about women's rights. And I want to throw in my little mite to keep the scales a-moving. Oh, I know it feels a kind of hissing and tickling like to see a colored woman get up and tell you about things and women's rights. Oh, we have all been thrown down so low that nobody thought we'd ever get up again. But we have been long enough talking now. We should have our rights. Oh, you may hiss as much as you like, but it's coming. I am sitting among you to watch, and every once in a while I will come out and tell you what kind of life it is.
Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. In 1853, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book sparked national debate and controversy over slavery and race relations in America. Later that year, upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln would say, "So, this is the little lady who made the big war." Sojourner Truth visited with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she asked her to sign her book of life. Harriet wrote about the visit many years later, once Sojourner Truth had already made a name for herself. If you ask me, I think that Harriet was just using Sojourner Truth to help boost up her book sales.
On one occasion, as our house was filled with company, notice was brought up to me that Sojourner Truth was below and requested an interview. Knowing nothing of her but her singular name, I went down, prepared to make the interview short. When I went into the room, a tall, spare form arose to meet me. I do not recollect ever to have been conversant with anyone who had more of that silent and subtle power which we call personal presence than this woman. Her tall form as she rose before me is still vivid to my mind. She seemed perfectly self-possessed and at her ease. In fact, there was almost an unconscious superiority, not unmixed with a solemn twinkle of humor in the odd, composed manner in which she looked down on me. Her whole air had at times a gloomy sort of drollery which impressed one strangely.
So this is you.
Yes.
Oh, well, honey, the Lord bless ye. I just came to have a look at ye. Oh, you done heard of me out, right?
I think I have. You go about lecturing, do you not?
Oh, yes, honey, that's what I do. The Lord bless me and I goes around to testify.
So saying, she took a seat, and stooping over and crossing her arms on her knees, she looked down upon the floor and seemed to fall into a sort of reverie. Her great gloomy eyes and her dark face seemed to work with some undercurrent of feeling. She sighed deeply, and occasionally broke out.
Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. The groans and the moans and the tears. Oh, Lord.
By this time, I thought her manner so original that it might be worthwhile to call down some of my friends. And she seemed perfectly well pleased with the idea. An audience was what she wanted. And so I called down Dr. Beecher, Professor Allen, and 2 or 3 other clergymen who, along with my husband and family, made a room full. No princess could have received a drawing room with more composed dignity than Sojourner her audience. She stood among them speaking, calm and erect, as one of her own native palm trees, waving
The history Mrs. Stowe wrote about me is not quite correct. But you will find in my book a correct history. And I never make use of the word honey.
No more,
No more, my Lord.
no more,
No more, my Lord.
Lord, I'll never
Lord, I'll never
turn back. No more, Lord, I'll never turn back. No more.
As you were speaking this morning of little children, I was looking around and thinking that it was most beautiful. Yet I never owned one. No one ever owned one. Some years ago, I learned that I was a human being. We had all been taught that we was a species of a monkey, baboon, orangutan, and we believed it. Yet we never seen any of these animals. But I believe
No
in the next world,
more, my
when we gets up yonder, we shall have all them rights restored to us again. All that love I've lost, all going to be restored to me again. Oh, how good God is. No more, no more, Lord, I'll never turn back. No more.
The second edition of the narrative of Sojourner Truth was published in 1857 with Frances Titus, friend and neighbor of Sojourner Truth, as her new editor.
At this time, it had an introduction by Harriet Beecher Stowe.
That same year, I sold my home in Northampton and bought a house in Harmonia, Michigan.
The site of another utopian community. Her daughters, Diana and Elizabeth, were with her in Harmonia, and their sons, James Caldwell and Samuel Banks, traveled with her as companions.
In 1859, John Brown led the massacre at Harper's Ferry. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. A year later, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And the Civil War began. Oh, we'll gather round the flag, boys, gather once again, shouting the battle cries of freedom. We'll gather at the hillside, gather at the flame, shouting the battle cries of freedom.
Around the same time, in the early 1860s, Sojourner Truth began making and selling small portraits of herself, known as carte de visite, as another way to raise money to support her work and travels.
I sell the shadow to support the substance.
The Union forever, hurrah, the boys hurrah, down with the traitor and up with the star. All will gather round the flag, boys, gather once again, shouting the battle cries of freedom.
Truth's photographs gave her an intangible independence, liberating her from the printed words of others. Now, she could not write, but she could project herself photographically. Photographs furnished a new means of communication, one more powerful than writing. Truth sat for at least 14 photographic portraits between 1863 and about 1875. While donations of any size were welcome, Sojourner asked 33 cents for each carte de visite.
Shouting the battle cries of freedom. The 54th Regiment of Massachusetts was established. It was the first African-American regiment in the Civil War.
Glory, glory, hallelujah.
That on the first day, January 18, 1863, all persons held as slaves in any state shall be thenceforward and forever free. As we go marching on, as we go marching on.
I believe the Lord needs me to do what I want to do. To go east in the spring and meet the freedmen of my own race and meet the first anti-slavery president. That same year, I took my grandson Sammy from New York State to Washington, D.C.
Sojourner Truth traveled with Lucy Coleman, a public school. She went to meet Abraham Lincoln in the White House. She traveled with Lucy Coleman, a public school teacher and advocate for women and children.
On October October 29th, 1864, Sojourner Truth and I met with Abraham Lincoln. Sojourner Truth dictated the following account of our meeting to Roland Johnson.
Lucy Coleman wrote her account of that very same meeting and printed it in her book, Reminiscences. Freedmen's Village, Virginia, November 17th, 1864.
When Mr. Lincoln was elected president, Sojourner determined to make the journey to Washington to see him, the first anti-slavery president. And so her friends sent her to me. Somehow, if anything was to be done for any special colored person, everybody far and near knew I was the one to be called upon to do it.
It was 8 o'clock a.m. when I called on the president.
When Sojourner arrived in Washington, she supposed she could walk right into the White House, have a good chat with the president, but it took some weeks to get an appointment for her.
I had quite a pleasant time waiting until he was disengaged and enjoying his conversations with others. He showed as much kindness and consideration to the coloreds as to the whites, if there was any difference more.
The appointment was made for one Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, and promptly at that hour we were there. At last, at 11:30, the call came for Mrs. Coleman and her friend. While we were waiting, there had come into the room a colored woman whom I asked if she had an appointment with the president. I said, "You may go in with me." And so I went into the room with two of the blackest women I ever saw. Not as my escort, but I as theirs.
The president was seated at his desk when Mrs. C said to him,
"This is Sojourner Truth, who has traveled all the way from Michigan to see you."
He then arose, took my hand, and said, "I am pleased to see you."
I am very happy, sir, to say to you that I have not come to ask any favor. My business is simply to present to you my friend, Sojourner Truth, a woman widely known not only in our country but abroad.
I said to him, "Mr. President, I appreciate you, for you are the best president that has ever taken seat." Then I said to him, "I have never heard of you before you were talked of for president." He smilingly replied, "I heard of you many times before that."
Mr. Lincoln was not himself with this colored woman. He had no funny story for her. He called her auntie, as he would his washerwoman. And when she complimented him on being the first anti-slavery president, he said, "I'm not an abolitionist. I wouldn't free the slaves if I could save the Union in any other way. I'm obliged to do it."
I must say, and I am proud to say, that I was never treated with more kindness and cordiality than were shown to me by that great and good man, Abraham Lincoln. By the grace of God, President of the United States for 4 years more. He then took my little book, and with the same hand that signed the death warrant of slavery, wrote as follows: Auntie Sojourner Truth, October 29, 1864, A. Lincoln.
I said, "We must not detain the president. Are you ready?" And saying goodbye, I had just reached the door when Mr. Lincoln said very earnestly, "Mrs. Coleman, won't you come back? Walk in here and take a seat." When we were done talking, which was some minutes, I knew he was not glad the war had made him the emancipator of 4 million slaves. Perhaps he came to rejoice over it when he realized that by the logic of events his name would be immortal through that act. But at that time he did not see it. He believed in the white race, not in the color, and did not want them put on an equality.
As I was taking my leave, he arose, took my hand, and said that he would be pleased to have me call again. I felt that I was in the presence of a friend.
In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Sojourner Truth was 68 years old.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
Freedmen's Village in Washington, D.C. The Freedmen's Village had been established to provide temporary refuge for freed slaves from Maryland and Virginia.
I counseled, preached, helped people to get jobs, and helped them resettle in the North.
Sojourner traveled to work on the streetcars. Now, streetcars had been desegregated by federal law in March 1865, but they seldom stopped for blacks. Even for a woman in her late 60s in need of public transportation. They caused her endless aggravation and personal injury, but not without a struggle. She knew her rights and insisted in having them. She once signaled a car whose driver and conductor passed her by, pretending not to see her. Another car followed, its driver evidently about to take the same tack. She raised her hand and shouted at the top of her lungs.
I want to ride! I want to ride! I want to ride!
Truth stopped not only the streetcar, but all the other traffic in the vicinity, wedging the streetcar in place. While it was blocked, Truth got on. The conductor, not amused, ordered her to go forward where the horses are, or I'll throw you out.
I am from the Empire State, and I know the laws as well as you do.
Think of it, from Sojourner Truth all the way to Rosa Parks. She truly helped to lay the foundation for the civil rights movement.
Truth stood her ground and drove with the other passengers.
In 1866, the American Equal Rights Association was formed as a coalition between women's rights and anti-slavery organizations. Also in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was founded, but Sojourner Truth pressed on.
My Lord, what a morning.
My Lord, what a morning.
Oh, my Lord, what a morning.
Oh, my Lord,
In May 1867, Sojourner Truth spoke at the first annual meeting of the American Equal Rights Association at the Church of the Puritans in New York City.
When the sun begins to shine.
my Lord, what a morning.
Oh, 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 my Lord, what a morning.
Well, children, when woman gets her rights, man will be right. How beautiful will that be? Then there will be peace on earth and goodwill to men. A woman said to me, do you think it would come in 10 or 20 years? Why, yes, it will come. It will come quickly. And now the waters are troubled, and now it's time to step into the pool. I want to see, before I leave here, I want to see equality. I want to see women have their rights, and then there will be no more wars. I have faith in God, and there is truth in humanity. Be strong, women. Blush not, tremble not. Oh, do you want it? 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 Yes. Women, do you want it? Yes. And after I go around and get my business settled, I will get more equality. I will shake every place I go to.
My Lord, what a morning.
Oh, my Lord, what a morning.
Oh, my Lord, what a morning.
My Lord, what a morning.
Oh, my Lord, what
I have lived 40 years in the anti-slavery cause. And I have pled with all the force that I had that one day the colored people might own their own body and soul. Well, this day has come. And though it has come through blood, I am sorry it has come that way. We are now trying for liberty that requires no blood. Give them what belongs to them. I ask it kindly, how beautiful will that be? Now, I don't want to take up much time, but I calculate to live. And if you want me to get up out of this world, you better have the women voting soon. I shan't go till I can do that.
When the sun begins to shine,
My Lord, what a morning.
when the sun begins to shine, the sun begins to shine. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, granting citizenship to all former slaves. In 1872, Sojourner Truth attempted to vote in Michigan, but she was turned away from the polls. Just think of it. Sojourner Truth never got the chance to vote in her lifetime. Women didn't even get the right to vote until 1920.
In 1875, we republished the narrative of Sojourner Truth, along with Truth's scrapbooks called her Book of Life.
With signatures from Ulysses S. Grant, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, and Abraham Lincoln.
In that same year, Sammy, Sojourner's grandson, became very ill. She returned home to be with him. He died shortly thereafter. In 1881, Sojourner addressed the members of the state legislature of Michigan who were considering a measure to institute capital punishment.
I have come here tonight to see about that thing that fairly shocked me. It shocked me worse than slavery. I heard that you are going to have a hanging in this state. Before God, only think of it. To think that this be the most blessed state in the Union, and it's being made the awful scene of hanging people by the neck until they are dead. Where is the man or woman who can sanction any law in their heart such as that? We are makers of murderers if we do it. But I am told that we must abide by the public laws. I won't abide by any law in my heart that upholds murder. I am against it. I am against it.
Sojourner closed her remarks and exhorted her listeners to acts of kindness. And when told that the Wyckoff hanging bill had been defeated, she shouted for joy and declared Michigan to be the most blessed state in the Union.
It was early in the morning. It was early in the morning. Just at the break of day, when he rose, when he rose, when he rose and went to heaven on a cloud. I am going home like a shooting star.
She told her family and friends. And then at 3 o'clock a.m. on the morning of November 26, 1883, Sojourner Truth died at age 86. She was eulogized as a dynamic woman with strength, integrity, poise, and wit. After the funeral, she was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery near her grandson, Sammy. A reporter described the last. The long line of carriages, the hearse with its black plumes, the people, also motionless, cloudless sky, the great round red sun lying low on the horizon. And when the coffin was lowered into the ground, the sun set. At the time of her death, a Battle Creek newspaper stated, "This country has lost one of its most remarkable personages."
So what have you dreamed of doing in your lifetime? And why haven't you done it yet? Sojourner Truth knew who she was. She lived her life shaking up every place she went to, and telling people just what time of night it is, and telling the truth, and holding nothing back. That's how I want to live my life. Summer days when nights are never long. Summer days I can feel so strong. I watch a sunset tonight, and I know everything will be alright. Yes, and I know